Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's the Historical Gamer once again, and today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different than anything I've really ever done before, and that's because we're going to be taking a look at a book. It's not really a book review, it's more of an initial impressions of a book, and I'll kind of explain what I mean. But real quick, before we get too far into that, the video that you see here in the background is me playing Command Modern Air Naval Operations. It's kind of the successor to the Harpoon series of games, which was largely inspiring of a book that was written during the Cold War by Tom Clancy called Red Storm Rising. And I thought it would be applicable because not only is the book that we're looking at the title Ghost Fleet, not only is it looking at kind of a hypothetical modern war, but it's also heavily inspired by Tom Clancy's Red Storm Rising book. The authors, P.W. Singer and August Cole, are both some pretty well-renowned sort of foreign policy, military kind of experts in kind of the DC circle. They write more nonfiction books than they write fiction. But this book, again titled Ghost Fleet, is about a hypothetical near-future war between the United States and China. And like I said, it's heavily inspired by Red Storm Rising to a large degree. It kind of looks at a hypothetical Chinese surprise attack on the United States. And without going into too much real quick, I should let you know that this is going to contain some spoilers. So, spoiler alert, if this is a book that you don't want to have some of the book spoiled for you, or at least the initial part of the book for you, I would recommend stopping watching this video now. But really what this video is all about is kind of my initial impressions on the first part of the book. I haven't finished the book yet, but I have some serious reservations about the book after reading the first 5 chapters or so of the 19 chapters. And I'll go into what I mean by that. Like I said, the book focuses on a hypothetical Chinese surprise attack on the United States in the near future. The exact date isn't specified, but basically there have been some financial and oil crises. The U.S. military has been cutting back its budget. Not that it's a small military at this time, but they've been dramatically cutting back on sorties of warships, on readiness of ships. Some programs have been canceled. The Zumwalt-class destroyers, for example, one of them was mothballed. The other 2 were sold off as scrap due to budget crises. Oil topped $200 a barrel, which seems crazy right now, but I guess there was some blowback against fracking after some environmental issues, and then there were some catastrophes in the Middle East, which pushed oil prices up. So basically, it's near future, sometime within the next decade. Some dramatic leaps in technology, but you still have like the F-35, which is in combat at the time. The LCS is still in combat at the time. So basically, it's about a decade into the future. They don't give an exact year. But the hypothesis is that the U.S. is now an oil and energy exporter, which is not too far in the distant future based on current trends. And China is obviously the world's largest economy by that point in time, one of the largest navies at that time, and dramatically in need of oil and resources. China discovers, and this happens in the first chapter, so it's not much of a spoiler, but China discovers a large natural gas deposit on kind of the border of where the U.S. territories are, inside the U.S. economic exclusion zone in the Mariana Islands near Guam, and the Chinese decide to attack the U.S. Due to kind of reckless U.S. foreign policy, which is basically, as one of the characters in the book puts it, the U.S. Foreign policy. They are basically acting like a drunken sailor, essentially, just reckless and bumbling around their newfound power as an oil exporter, and that China basically has to protect its interest and security by eliminating the U.S. threat, allowing China to get at the resources that they need to get at the seafloor. And I guess what is kind of a monumental gas discovery, like I said, in the Marianas, that has the potential to shift global natural gas demand. So that's kind of the plot and the reason that China attacks. And, you know, other than just discovering the oil the natural gas, and the fact that the U.S. apparently has been acting very rashly to China as well as to the rest of the world with regards to the U.S.'s oil exporting, the attack justification seems a little bit flimsy. One of the real strengths, I think, coming from Red Storm Rising is it was very detailed and explicit in why Russia had to come and attack the United States in the Cold War. Basically, there was a terrorist attack on one of Russia's oil refineries that produced over 1/3 of Russia's total oil output, and that without that, Russia would be severely dependent on the West and NATO in order to gain access to oil reserves. So Russia needed to invade the Middle East essentially to secure its own security. It did a very good job of going into the minutia of why it was important to attack and why it was important for the Russians. They basically had a 6-month window to win a war against NATO so they could turn south and deal with the Middle East and take those reserves. So it did a much better job, I thought, of making the case for war. In this book, I don't really get the case for China's attack. It basically just tells you that the U.S. has been reckless and that China's destiny is intertwined, and that Alfred Thayer Mahan basically said that a nation has destiny and they have to follow that destiny whether they like it or not, and China has no choice but to attack the U.S. But it seems like a really flimsy justification. I like the aspect that China's moved past the Communist Party to kind of a technocratic elite. I think that's a realistic sort of transition that China could go through. Short of being democratic, it could be a very kind of technocratic type economy ruled by the military and the industrial elites. I think that is definitely something that could happen, and that's plausible. But again, the attack on the U.S. just seems very poorly put together, or at least poorly explained, and that's frustrating to me because a large degree of suspending your disbelief in a book like this relies on that premise being solid, and that's something where I think Red Storm Rising really got it well, and here it just seemed kind of skimped over to jump ahead to the war. I really feel like maybe this book is a little bit too short. It's 19 chapters long. It's very well researched, has lots of footnotes and endnotes, but I do think, which is unique for a fiction book, but I do think that kind of in this element, they did a poor job of setting the stage for war. It just seemed pretty, just not all that well explained to the reader, and I understand what they were going for, but they could have used more examples or done a better job of explaining, even with more detail, why this was important. It just seems too superficial to really be convincing. And then comes my real beef with the book so far. Again, this isn't a full review because I haven't read the whole book, so maybe the second half of the book is absolutely astonishingly well put together, and that's all fine and good. But another aspect of suspending disbelief is how do you get to the crux of the book? Well, and here comes some bigger spoilers. In the book, China launches a surprise attack on the United States, which was obviously decades in the making by the way that it's all made up. And my problem with that surprise attack is not that it happens, or not necessarily the way that it happens, but the efficiency that it happens. Just seems too far beyond anything that I've ever heard of or seen of in any military operation ever to be believable. So, in general, China at the start of the book is in the middle of border skirmishes with Russia over Siberia and kind of migration and migrant workers there, which is, again, believable. I think, if anything, the next major conflict in the world could very well be Russia versus China. It doesn't sound like it right now today based on kind of the Putin-China economic sphere, but as resources and demands go up for that and China continues to essentially be colonizing Siberia, there certainly is the potential for conflict there. But the point is, China's doing this entirely as a spoof, entirely as a cover, and the U.S. intelligence in this book is none the wiser. Apparently they buy totally into the fact that the Chinese and the Russians are attacking and killing each other on the border, and it's all a big, giant spoof. That seems a little bit hard to believe, the idea of these two nations duking it out and killing each other, and then shifting gears entirely and having that all just be one elaborate hoax. You would think with all the intelligence capabilities, you'd be able to tell what's really going on and how that really isn't a factor. But okay, fine. Let's just ignore that one aspect and say somehow they did a great job of acting like they wanted to kill each other when they really didn't and they were all in on the same side. Fine. I suppose that's believable that could happen. Then what happens? Well, the Russians launch a carrier-borne attack on Japan. Basically just a recreation of the Doolittle strike, where Russian fighter jets take off from an aircraft carrier and hit U.S. forces in Japan, and they do so at a range that surprises the Americans because then they're going to land in China, which is right next to Okinawa, rather than return to the carrier, so they're able to hit at a longer range than was expected. Okay, that's a not totally novel. Obviously, Jimmy Doolittle did it, but that's a plausible thing. They catch the U.S. aircraft completely by surprise, and the vast majority of the U.S. aircraft are stationed in the open rather than in their hardened hangars. Okay, they flew over all of Japan as well, and somehow confusing radio traffic messages get put out and confuse the Japanese, who don't shoot down the Russian aircraft because of bureaucracy and red tape. Okay, again, that's something that I think is plausible. So we've got two things here which are a little bit out there, but both are definitely plausible. Both taken in a vacuum would work fine. Together, I think those are fine explanations. So basically that attack cripples the U.S. Air Force in the West. The attacks also cripple the U.S. fleet in Japan, sinking a U.S. carrier or crippling it, it's not quite clear, as well as other U.S. warships. Basically, these attacks totally decimate U.S. military forces in the Western Pacific. Again, having that much success from a couple dozen Russian aircraft taking off from an aircraft carrier seems a little bit out there. I mean, taking out an entire U.S. Air Force base as well as an entire U.S. carrier battle group, again, you're starting to getting into the plausibility area. 20 plus jets destroying a carrier and an airbase and other targets throughout Japan. Okay, I'm willing to believe it, but again, that this isn't it. Then the next thing that happens is U.S. carrier battle group is hit by an intercontinental anti-aircraft ballistic missile, which is something that the Chinese have been working on. The DF-21D carrier killer, anti-carrier whatever ICBM. There's a lot of speculation on how accurate this will be or how good this will be, but basically in the book it's incredibly effective. They launch something like 90 or 20? Either way, they launch a whole bunch of them against the U.S. carrier battle group, and they destroy a U.S. carrier. But then they also have the ability to destroy a submerged submarine as well, without the U.S. having any idea that this was a capability of the weapon. Okay. So you're telling me that not only did the Russians with just 24 aircraft decimate the entire U.S. Air Force in the Western Pacific in a surprise attack with little to no warning, but without the U.S. getting any aircraft off the ground, but you're also telling me that the Chinese had some super secret ability to knock out submarines with an intercontinental ballistic missile, as well as the U.S. carrier battle group, and all the U.S. weapons systems against them were completely useless? Okay, again, the idea of China having a secret weapon there that's much more effective than we suspect is possible, but when you couple it together with the surprise attack on all U.S. forces in the Western Pacific, decimating everything that the U.S. has there, again, it's starting to mount on the disbelief level. And I think it's important we look back to Red Storm Rising, which was an incredibly well-done book about a surprise Russian attack in the Warsaw Pact countries against NATO in Europe. And it's important to remember, It's important to remember that the Russians had been building up their forces for months. There had been intelligence that there was something going on. The Americans weren't sure what exactly. They knew something was happening. They could tell that the Russians were gearing up for a large-scale offensive. Again, they could tell something was happening. They just didn't know what. And by the time the attack actually happened, it was no secret, because the amount of force that was necessary to overwhelm the American forces in Europe would just be impossible to keep secret. And then even once the attack began, the American forces in the region were able to surprise the Russians and initiate some severe setbacks. The notable F-19 stealth fighter aircraft in that book, which basically took out huge portions of the Russian Air Force in the very early time of the Russian attack, played a key role in blunting Russia's military success. Thus far, with these three things that we've mentioned so far, there's been no success for the Americans. Everything's gone 100% the Chinese way. Then you have also a satellite attack in which a Chinese space-based laser knocks out the entire U.S. space grid, the entire U.S. GPS military communications network of over 40-plus satellites without loss, incident, or mechanical malfunction. And apparently the U.S. had no idea that this was up there. Okay, and let's also not forget that the Chinese had been conducting numerous drills on this, and it was in part of a space station. So I think the threat to the U.S. military satellite infrastructure is serious, and I think that these are, again, all plausible outcomes, but the fact that they all come without setback is, again, a little bit hard to believe. And then here's the kicker. Here's the one that really kind of throws me off the deep end. With all of these other things going off perfectly without a hitch, you have the Chinese still launching yet another successful, devastating attack, this one on Pearl Harbor itself. The Chinese sneak several large freighters into Pearl Harbor with military forces, tanks, and everything, all ready to invade Hawaii without so much as a whisper of intel or indication on the American side that anything is going on. Right. Oh, and did we mention the Chinese also have divers who are placing mines on the bottom of half the U.S. ships, which basically caused the U.S. to lose every single warship in Pearl Harbor. One LCS makes it out because it has a main character, but then that still gets sunk by a submarine. So the entire U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor is destroyed by a surprise attack, surprise miners putting mines on the bottom of ships, and the Chinese land what has to be at least a division of infantry at Pearl Harbor on the Hawaiian Islands without incident. I'm sorry, but this is... Oh, and by the way, the F-35, I forgot one more thing. The F-35 fighter jet, the much maligned fighter project for the U.S., apparently has secret software that's embedded in it that allows Chinese weapons to see through the stealth and basically just act like a homing device so that the Chinese weapons can just home in on the U.S. fighter without the U.S. fighter having any kind of recourse. So basically it just has a big beam of, come shoot me if you're a Chinese missile. I understand that all these things are technically possible. What the book explains is technically possible, yes. But it's more of a horror book than it is an actual realistic example of how a military operation would play out. I could not imagine, and I'm not saying it's impossible because I think each one of these items could happen, but there's literally not a single setback for the Chinese in the first 5 chapters of this book. Their entire plan goes off without a hitch, without the U.S. intelligence community having any idea what's going on. Their entire communications network gets taken offline. The entire fleet is destroyed. Secret super weapons and secret, hacks embedded in U.S. military equipment allow basically everything to get destroyed. And the book is essentially ripping on millennials, saying, they're garbage and, it's going to be the old salts who save us. So I really wanted to like this book, and I'm going to finish it because there's a lot of really good aspects in this book. I think some of the, tying into future technologies and perhaps what some elements of combat in the way that drones and non-drones may interact. I think there's a lot of really good aspects in this book. But the actual premise of the attack and the way that the war unfolds, it's so far from anything that you've ever seen in any kind of surprise attack, just in the scale. It's not that any of these couldn't happen. I've already mentioned that. It's the way that it happens. It's the way that everything goes off perfectly without a hitch. And again, it's almost like Hawaii is the Iceland. I think it was Iceland in Red Storm Rising where the Russians take Iceland as kind of a buffer against the U.S. fleet to kind of get the control of the North Sea area so the Russians have more of a free hand and protects their shorelines. And kind of acts as a bomber base to help cripple U.S. carriers in the Atlantic. So it's almost like Hawaii's acting like that kind of tripwire to any U.S. counterattack like Iceland was in Red Storm Rising. So there's a lot of parallels. And also the Russians secretly take Iceland through kind of like hovercraft and secret troops being transported on commercial craft and getting into shore without any surprise, and then a surprise air attack on the Air Force at Iceland. But here's the thing. That's a small remote base with, half a dozen fighters that gets hit by the Russian aircraft. Well, more than half a dozen, but a dozen, maybe 20 fighters get hit by Russian aircraft, and then troops come ashore, maybe a division of troops, but some of them are paratroopers as well. And, let's face it, the U.S. forces on Iceland were never that large. I would imagine there's at least a Marine division at the island of Hawaii. So the idea of the Chinese getting the jump and overwhelming that large of a force and that large of a base all simultaneously without loss, without issue, it just seems ludicrous. So I guess the lesson of this book is that the U.S. fighter fleet is hacked by the Chinese, and the Chinese can easily home in on it. Okay, maybe, sure, I suppose that's possible. The U.S. communications satellite fleet is wiped out. A surprise attack by Russian aircraft wipes out the entire U.S. Pacific fleet, as well as Okinawa and all the other U.S. air bases. Like 20 Russian aircraft would probably be that effective. And then also the Chinese intercontinental anti-ship missiles also are able to take out submarines, apparently, as well as aircraft carriers. It just... If you want your book to be compelling, and you want your book to be a real, realistic look at combat, I think you have to recognize the fact that no plan of this size and scope would likely ever be that successful. Even the ultimately incredibly successful Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor erred in that the U.S. carriers weren't at port. Or the fact that the attacks on the Philippines didn't quite go off as well as they had hoped. Or that it was more neglect on the U.S. Air Force's part at the Philippines that allowed the Japanese to have their success versus secret Japanese superweapons. And the fact that this didn't all happen at once. There were several battles, several engagements over a wide scale of time. It's too well coordinated. It's too perfect to be believable. I'm not saying, again, and I'm kind of just rehashing myself, I'm not saying that any one of these is impossible. But if you want your book to be about the next World War, and you're trying to make it realistic by having over 40 pages of endnotes that reference all these different items here, you've got to acknowledge the fact that no operation that takes place all the way across from the Western Pacific all the way to Hawaii into space is going to be this perfectly executed simultaneously without any hints or warnings. And that's one of the big aspects. The U.S. is taken totally unawares, totally surprised. The U.S. wasn't unaware at Pearl Harbor. They didn't know exactly what was coming, but they knew something was coming. The U.S. wasn't unaware in Red Storm Rising. They knew something was coming. They just didn't know what was coming. The idea that this information age in the future, the Chinese could be that secretive, as if the Americans wouldn't be hacking Chinese equipment. We often get lost in the fact that we always hear about these Chinese organizations that are hacking into U.S. databases and stealing U.S. information. But apparently the Chinese are also placing backdoors in the software and in the processors of all of our fighter jets without anyone knowing. And apparently the U.S. is doing nothing about it and knows nothing about it. The U.S. is out there and hacking quite a bit as well, stealing information off of our enemies as well. And I don't think that in 10 years the Chinese are going to be perfect hackers and have this entire elaborate battle plan set up that requires the knowledge of hundreds of thousands of Chinese individuals, and the U.S. intelligence infrastructure would be none the wiser. It's not plausible. It's not believable. Again, I really wanted to like this book, and I have no problem with the surprise attack devastating U.S. forces as the plot for the book. But you need to make it more believable than literally everything goes wrong. 100% of everything breaks for the U.S. All their fancy new toys, everything is just total shit. Literally, this is not a credible story. It's not a credible backdrop. It's a horror movie. The Boogeyman, everything is perfect. Everything of yours sucks. Okay. Again, I'm sorry I'm ranting like this because it just I don't even think I'm articulating myself as well as I could be. But it just seems lazy. Add 100 pages, make it more plausible, have some setbacks for the Chinese. And that's ignoring the fact that this book is all over, jumping months at a time without any explanation really of what's gone on. It's a style of book I wanted to like. It's a topic I wanted to like. I can't suspend my disbelief as long as it's required for all of this to work. It's like literally every negative piece of literature possible was put together for every single U.S. weapon system, and 100% of it was proven to be true. When has that ever been true? for anything, ever. Anyway, guys, that's enough of my frustration. I apologize for this probably could have been cut down by 10 minutes. I appreciate you tuning in. This was something a little bit different. I hope you enjoyed. And until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and I'm out.